Imagine this. A family full of hope and dreams finally finds a place they can call home. After years of saving, scraping by, and enduring hardship, they move into a modest apartment building in the heart of a community where they believe they can finally put down roots. They are hard-working, honest, and driven by a singular goal: to create a better life for themselves and their children. This building isn't just a roof over their heads. It's a symbol of everything they've worked for. But not everyone in this story shares that vision. The landlord, a man driven by prejudice and greed, sees the family as something else entirely. A nuisance, an inconvenience, and, worst of all, a target. At first, it starts small. Requests for basic repairs are ignored. Rules are enforced unequally, and there's a palpable tension every time they cross paths. But soon, his intentions become all too clear. One day, without warning, they receive a notice. Their time is up. No reason, no negotiation, just the harsh reality of being told, "You don't belong here." And why? Because of the color of their skin. For most people, this would be the end of the story. A tragic tale of injustice, a family displaced by the cruelty of systemic racism. But for this family, it was just the beginning. What happened next would not only turn the tables, but rewrite the entire narrative. This is a story of resilience, of fighting back against a system stacked against them, and of poetic justice so sweet it defies belief. What happens when power shifts in the face of discrimination? What happens when the evicted become the owners? Stay with us, because this story is one you won't soon forget. To understand the depth of this story, you need to know the family at the heart of it. Meet the Johnsons. Marcus, a factory worker with hands calloused from years of hard labor, and Vanessa, a school teacher whose patience and warmth have changed countless young lives. Marcus and Vanessa Johnson were no strangers to hard work. Both came from humble beginnings, raised in a small southern town where opportunities were scarce and challenges were plenty. Marcus, the eldest of 6 siblings, had spent his teenage years juggling school and odd jobs to help his family make ends meet. Vanessa, the daughter of a single mother, had fought tirelessly to earn her teaching degree while working nights at a diner. For them, success wasn't about wealth or status. It was about stability, about giving their children a life where they wouldn't have to struggle the way they had. Moving to the city was supposed to be the start of that dream, and when they found the small apartment in a neighborhood they could afford, they thought they had finally found their footing. The apartment wasn't perfect. The building showed its age with creaky floors and leaky faucets, but to the Johnsons it was a chance to plant roots, a place to grow, to thrive. They signed the lease with hope in their hearts, unaware of the challenges that awaited them. But every story has its antagonist. Enter Charles Whitaker, the landlord, a man who saw his tenants not as people, but as dollar signs. For Whitaker, managing the building wasn't about creating a community. It was about control, power, and profit. Whitaker wasn't just indifferent to his tenants, he was discriminatory. His disdain for the Johnson family was evident from the very beginning. While other tenants received warm welcomes, the Johnsons were met with curt replies and barely concealed sneers. When Vanessa approached him about fixing the heater in their apartment, Whitaker dismissed her with a wave of his hand, muttering something about budget constraints. Yet, just days later, a repair crew was seen replacing the thermostat in the apartment upstairs, occupied by a young white couple. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over time, the Johnsons began to notice a pattern: maintenance requests ignored, utility bills inexplicably higher than their neighbors. Even the communal spaces like the laundry room seemed to be off-limits to them, with out-of-order signs mysteriously appearing whenever Vanessa or the kids tried to use them. Whitaker's prejudice wasn't confined to subtle acts. At tenant meetings, his condescension toward the Johnsons was glaring. When Marcus raised concerns about a leaking roof, Whitaker interrupted him with a dismissive laugh, saying, "Maybe you should focus on paying rent on time instead of playing handyman." For the Johnsons, this wasn't just about a bad landlord. It was about something much deeper. They weren't just fighting for their comfort. They were fighting against a system that seemed designed to keep them in their place. And while Whitaker saw himself as untouchable, the Johnsons were quietly building their resolve. Every setback only strengthened their determination. For Marcus and Vanessa, giving up was never an option. Their children deserved better, and they were willing to fight for it, even if it meant taking on the very man who held the keys to their home. What Whitaker didn't realize was that this family's strength didn't come from their circumstances. It came from their unity. And soon he would learn that, when pushed too far, even the smallest flame can ignite a revolution. Life in the building carried on as usual, but for the Johnson family, the cracks in their newfound home were starting to show. Tensions between them and Charles Whitaker, the landlord, had been simmering for months. What began as subtle neglect was escalating into outright hostility. Vanessa, ever the optimist, still believed things could change. She compiled a list of needed repairs, leaks, a broken heater, the flickering hallway light outside their door, and brought it directly to Whitaker. But as she stood there waiting for an answer, the door cracked open just enough for him to peer out, his expression unreadable. No promises, no explanations. Just the sound of a lock clicking behind her. Vanessa walked away with a sinking feeling in her chest, but it wasn't just the repairs that worried her. It was the way Whitaker's dismissive glare lingered, as if he was already planning his next move. Meanwhile, Marcus noticed other, more insidious signs of trouble. The family's utility bills were inexplicably higher than their neighbors. Packages left for them at the front desk mysteriously went missing. Even the parking lot wasn't safe. One morning, Marcus found their car scratched and their tires deflated. There were no witnesses, no proof, just a growing sense that they were being targeted. And through it all, Whitaker kept his distance, letting his actions, or lack thereof, speak volumes. But the Johnsons weren't completely alone. Some neighbors sympathized with their plight, whispering about similar experiences with Whitaker's discriminatory practices. An older tenant, Mrs. Alvarez, recounted how she'd been threatened with eviction for letting her grandchildren visit too often. Another, a young couple, admitted they'd received far better treatment, but felt powerless to intervene. Still, others sided with Whitaker, either out of fear or shared prejudice. The Johnsons' presence, it seemed, was a litmus test for the building's true colors. And then one evening, the storm that had been brewing finally broke. It was rare for Whitaker to visit his tenants in person, and the grim look on his face made it clear. This wasn't a friendly call. Marcus unfolded the paper, his hands trembling as he read the words that no family wants to see. Eviction notice. The letter cited vague violations and overdue fees that didn't exist. It was clear this wasn't about rules or money. This was about power. Shock gave way to fear, and fear gave way to anger. Marcus clenched his fists, his voice shaking as he read the notice aloud. Vanessa, always the steady one, tried to comfort him, but even her calm facade was beginning to crack. She wasn't wrong. The Johnsons had paid their rent on time, abided by every rule, and treated the building with care. But fairness wasn't part of Whitaker's equation. The eviction notice sent ripples through the building. Some tenants were outraged, vowing to stand by the Johnsons and help them fight back. Others avoided eye contact in the hallways, too afraid to challenge Whitaker's authority. For every act of support, there was an equal measure of silence or complicity. And yet, the Johnsons held their heads high, and they knew This wasn't just about them. That night, as the rain continued to fall, the Johnsons made a decision. They wouldn't let Whitaker win. They wouldn't let him push them out of their home without a fight. But little did they know, their battle would soon take an unexpected turn. One that would change everything. For many, an eviction notice might have been the end of the story, a chapter closed against their will. But for the Johnsons, it was a call to action. They weren't just fighting to keep a roof over their heads. They were fighting for their dignity, their rights, and their future. Their first step was to seek legal advice, but as they soon discovered, the system wasn't designed to favor families like theirs. Most lawyers turned them away, citing a lack of resources or conflicts of interest. Those willing to listen demanded fees the Johnsons simply couldn't afford. Finally, they found a small legal aid office willing to take their case. The lawyer, Mr. Grayson, listened carefully as they recounted months of neglect and harassment, but even he couldn't promise them an easy path forward. It wasn't the answer they'd hoped for, but it was enough to keep their hope alive. The Johnsons left the office with a folder of paperwork and a spark of determination, ready to take the fight to the next level. Doubt crept in during the quiet moments. Was it worth the fight? Could they really win against someone as ruthless as Whitaker? But every time those questions arose, they reminded themselves why they were doing this: for their children, for their community, and for every family who had been forced out of their home simply because of the color of their skin. Word of their fight began to spread, drawing support from unexpected places. Neighbors who had once stayed silent stepped forward with stories of their own. Leaks ignored, rent hikes without explanation, threats for speaking out. Slowly, a picture of Whitaker's long-standing discrimination began to emerge. The Johnsons weren't just tenants anymore. They were leaders in a growing movement. But as they rallied their community, an opportunity they hadn't anticipated was quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Unknown to the Johnsons, Whitaker's financial empire was crumbling. Years of mismanagement and rising debts had caught up to him. The very building he lorded over was now a liability, and he was quietly looking for a way out. It was during one of their strategy meetings that the truth came to light. Mr. Grayson had stumbled across public records showing that Whitaker had listed the building for sale. It was a revelation that changed everything. The idea seemed impossible at first. How could they, a working-class family, possibly afford such a purchase? But where others saw obstacles, the Johnsons saw an opportunity. Pooling their savings, cashing in retirement funds, and reaching out to friends and family for loans, the Johnsons began to piece together a plan. It was a gamble, a high-stakes move that required every ounce of their courage and resourcefulness. They didn't just stop at their own resources. The community they'd rallied came through in ways they never expected. Neighbors donated, activists organized fundraisers, and even strangers moved by their story pitched in to help. Finally, the day came to make their offer. Every step of the process was fraught with uncertainty. Would their bid be accepted? Would Whitaker find out and sabotage the deal? But the Johnsons had come too far to turn back now. Against all odds, their bid was accepted. The Johnsons weren't just tenants anymore, they were owners. But their victory wasn't just about securing a home. It was about justice, about turning the tables on a man who thought he held all the power. For the Johnsons, the fight was far from over, but they had proven something important: that in the face of discrimination, unity and determination could overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression. They had turned their eviction into empowerment, their struggle into a symbol of hope. The Johnsons had reached the final hurdle. After months of planning, fundraising, and navigating the complexities of real estate, the moment of truth was finally here. The purchase agreement was drafted, and the family prepared to sign the papers that would change their lives forever. But as with every step of their journey, it wasn't without its challenges. A last-minute bidding war threatened to derail everything. Another buyer, a real estate investor with deep pockets, entered the scene, driving up the price and forcing the Johnsons to reconsider their position. The Johnsons scrambled to adjust their bid. With help from their lawyer and newfound community supporters, they managed to secure additional funding. It was a tense and nail-biting process, every minute feeling like an eternity as they waited for the seller's decision. Finally, the call came. Their offer had been accepted. Relief washed over the family as they realized they had won. They weren't just buying a building, they were reclaiming their place in a system that had tried to erase them. When the day of the closing arrived, the Johnsons sat across from the seller, signing the final documents. The weight of the moment was palpable. Each signature brought them closer to owning not just their home, but also their dignity and a piece of justice they had fought so hard to achieve. Yet, their victory was still shrouded in secrecy. The landlord, Whitaker, had no idea who the new owners of his building were. His ignorance only added to the suspense as the Johnsons prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Whitaker's realization came swiftly. The sale had been finalized, and as part of the transition, the Johnsons arranged to meet him for the official handover of property details. Whitaker arrived, expecting to meet a faceless corporate buyer or another wealthy investor. Instead, he found himself face to face with Marcus and Vanessa Johnson. At first, Whitaker was confused. Then, realization dawned. His face turned red as he stammered out questions, his disbelief quickly morphing into anger. How could this family, the very people he had sought to remove, have managed to turn the tables so completely? Whitaker demanded answers, attempting to assert authority that no longer belonged to him. But with the paperwork signed and the transaction complete, there was nothing he could do. The Johnsons stood firm, their calm confidence in stark contrast to Whitaker's fury. Whitaker's outrage turned to desperation. He accused the family of trickery, calling the sale a scam, but each claim was met with legal documentation, ironclad and irrefutable. Slowly he realized there was no escape from the reality he had created. The Johnsons were no longer tenants, they were his landlords. For Whitaker, the blow was devastating. He had prided himself on control, using his power to oppress and intimidate. But now, that control was gone, stripped away by the very people he had underestimated and mistreated. The irony was undeniable, and his defeat complete. As Whitaker left the building for the last time, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his failure. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. He had no choice but to accept the new reality, a reality in which the Johnsons had won, not just their home, but also the moral high ground. The purchase of the building marked a turning point for the Johnsons. It wasn't just a victory against Whitaker, it was a victory against a system that had long been stacked against families like theirs. They had proven that perseverance, unity, and courage could overcome even the most entrenched forms of discrimination. With the ink on the ownership documents dried, the Johnson family stepped into a new chapter, not just as homeowners, but as leaders. Their first act as the building's new owners was to address the issues that had plagued its residents for years. The same issues that Whitaker had ignored, dismissed, or weaponized against them. They began with the basics: repairs. Broken pipes, faulty wiring, and long-neglected structural issues were prioritized. Marcus took charge of coordinating contractors, while Vanessa personally inspected each unit to ensure that no tenant was overlooked. They knew what it felt like to be disregarded, and they vowed to make sure no one in their building felt that way again. Next came policy changes. Rent hikes that Whitaker had imposed without justification were rolled back, and the Johnsons introduced transparent policies that prioritized fairness and communication. They created a tenant council inviting all residents to participate in decisions about the building's future. For the first time, the voices of those who called the building home truly mattered. The transformation was immediate and profound. The once neglected building began to feel like a community. Neighbors who had rarely spoken to one another came together to celebrate the changes. Walls that had been cracked and peeling were repainted with vibrant colors. A neglected courtyard became a shared space for gatherings and celebrations. For the Johnsons, this wasn't just about improving a building, it was about healing a community. They knew that their victory wasn't just theirs alone. It was a beacon of hope for others who had faced similar injustices, proof that systemic racism and oppression could be confronted and overcome. As the building thrived under new management, Whitaker's life took a starkly different turn. The sale of the building might have provided him with short-term relief, but his financial troubles ran deeper than a single property. Years of mismanagement and legal battles over discriminatory practices began to catch up with him. Lawsuits from former tenants emerged, bolstered by the Johnsons' victory. Residents who had suffered under Whitaker's neglect and harassment now felt empowered to speak out. The courts took notice, and Whitaker found himself embroiled in costly legal battles that drained his resources further. The very actions he had taken to exert control over others became the source of his undoing. Banks foreclosed on his remaining properties, and his reputation as a landlord was irreparably damaged. Meanwhile, the Johnson story spread beyond the walls of their building. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a triumph of justice and resilience. Community organizers and activists used it as an example of how collective action and determination could bring about meaningful change. The Johnsons were invited to speak at neighborhood meetings and housing advocacy events, sharing their experiences and inspiring others to stand up against discrimination. What began as a personal fight for survival had grown into a movement that challenged the status quo. For the Johnsons, the journey was far from over. They understood that owning the building was just one step in a larger fight for equality and justice. But as they looked around at the thriving community they had helped create, they knew they had made a difference. In the end, the Johnsons didn't just reclaim their home. They redefined what it meant to belong. They turned a symbol of oppression into a beacon of hope, proving that even in the face of adversity, justice could prevail. The journey of the Johnson family is one that transcends the confines of a single building. It is a story of endurance in the face of systemic barriers, of fighting not only for survival but for dignity. They began as tenants targeted by prejudice, reduced to nothing more than a line item in Whitaker's profit and loss ledger. But they ended as symbols of justice and hope, reshaping the very foundation of their community. The turning points of this journey are as vivid as they are impactful. The unjust eviction notice, the moments of doubt that tested their resolve, the painstaking process of becoming homeowners, and the dramatic confrontation that left Whitaker in stunned disbelief. Each moment builds upon the last, a testament to the power of resilience. Yet this story is more than just the Johnsons' triumph. It reflects the broader struggle against systemic racism, a system designed to hold people back based on the color of their skin. The challenges they faced, ignored maintenance requests, unfair eviction practices, and systemic bias are not unique to them. They are lived realities for countless others who, unlike the Johnsons, may not yet have had their day of justice. But the story doesn't end with the Johnsons reclaiming their home and turning it into a beacon of hope. It leaves us with questions. How many other families are being pushed out of their homes by landlords like Whitaker? How often do these stories go unheard, their injustices unchallenged? And most importantly, what can we do to ensure more victories like this one? These questions are uncomfortable but necessary, a reminder that systemic racism persists in many forms. The Johnsons' victory shows us what's possible, but it also underscores the work that remains. It's a call to action. For all of us to confront discrimination when we see it, to stand in solidarity with those fighting for justice, and to push for systemic change in our communities and beyond. Their story is proof that justice isn't just an abstract ideal. It's something that can be achieved with persistence, courage, and unity. And when justice is served, it doesn't just impact the immediate victims. It sends ripples through entire communities, inspiring others to stand up and demand their rights. In a world where too many stories of injustice end in silence, the Johnson story reminds us of what's possible when silence is broken and action is Taken. It's a story of poetic irony where the very tools of oppression became instruments of liberation. The man who thought he held all the power was brought down by those he sought to control. And now, their story is in your hands. Share it, discuss it. Let it inspire conversations about the realities of systemic racism and the ways we can dismantle it. Let it remind us all that change begins when we refuse to accept injustice as the norm. Justice isn't always easy, and it doesn't always come quickly. But when it's served, it leaves a mark that lasts forever, a mark on the individuals who fought for it, the communities who witnessed it, and the systems that must reckon with it. The Johnsons left their mark. Now the question is, how will you leave yours? Thank you for watching. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that matter. And most importantly, remember, every small action against injustice is a step toward a better world.